Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Laura Kellums. I'm the Northwest Arkansas Director. I'm at Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families, and I'm a member of the Strategic Communications Subcommittee of the Kids Count Steering Committee. And I'm newly taking over as chair of that committee. So special shout out to Tara Manthe there for her. How long did you chair the subcommittee? You're on mute.
It tells you you're muted even. I don't know. I was August 2015, I think, was when I joined the steering committee and was made the chair.
Just that's what they did to me too. So you've been chair for a while, so thank you for doing it. And one reason that Tara's not chair anymore is she has become chair of the whole steering committee. So thank you, Tara, on behalf of the whole Kids Count Network for all your leadership on that. And we look forward to having you as our chair for the next year. And Tara's promised to continue to participate as much as she can in the calls, because for one thing, she has a lot of experience as our chair, but also just in communication in general for Kids Count groups. Tara's with Colorado Children's Campaign. And she actually worked at my organization, Arkansas Advocates, years ago too. So all of you who are, we just want you to know that the Strategic Communications Work Group really wants to hear your feedback. Do these work for you guys? Is this a good way to talk about these issues, or would you like to learn? If you want to learn about a specific issue or anything like that, we certainly are open to having these. One thing that's great about them is that they're kind of informal chats, and we can kind of talk about anything we want. So do let us know if there are issues that you want us to cover. But of course, as you know, we're here to talk today about the data book release, which is coming up in only a couple of weeks, obviously less than a couple of weeks, on the 27th. And we want to talk about how to get more news coverage. I actually was a longtime newspaper reporter. Well, for 15 years, I was a newspaper reporter. And I actually remember getting, I guess they must have been some of the early editions of it, but I remember getting the Kids Count data book, like a big book in the mail, and that they would call and ask if we wanted to receive the book and all the information. And I remember thinking that it was a big deal, and that I was sort of obligated to my community to pay attention to it because it had to do with the children of Arkansas, and I felt like that was important to pay attention to. And so we definitely want reporters to continue to think that way, that this information is important and worth their time, because obviously it is. So with that, we want to talk about ways to kind of attract their attention and get people interested in this data. So Oliver Bernstein, the communications director at the Center for Public Policy Priorities in Texas, was kind enough to join us today. Hey, Oliver.
Hi, everybody.
And Texas does a good job of getting media coverage every year. So we wanted to talk a little bit to Oliver about what some of his best tips might be. Can you tell us a little bit to start, Oliver, about just what kind of coverage you got last year? What did it look like statewide?
Sure, and let me know if you can't hear me well enough.
Hear you perfectly.
So we got, pretty strong coverage statewide, certainly in a lot of the big metro areas, and Texas has a lot of very large cities and metro areas. But I think finding those local angles, the ability of the Kids Count products to, put out kind of local data of interest, and so. We have a couple of statewide kind of public radio shows that we've gotten coverage on every year. Certainly the big daily newspapers. We have been pretty good about getting Spanish language coverage with our Univision affiliate, primarily around the data book. And then in terms of TV, again, some TV here in Austin and the Capitol that sort of either has a statewide audience or more like a state policy focus. They're concerned about issues related to the whole state, or really more so when we have local partners or folks that we can work with in the other parts of the state, we get some TV coverage as well. So really a little bit of everything. It changes a little bit each year, but I think we've found the ability to make the report and the findings interesting to people from lots of parts of the state and in lots of different formats.
In a huge state with such a big population and such a wide-ranging population, I would imagine that would be a really big challenge trying to find, I don't even understand how that would work staff-wise to try to find, you know, information niches for such a huge area.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing that we've really learned, which is related to that, is, you know, it was when I first started here about 4 years ago, I met with, at the time, a Wall Street Journal correspondent who was based in Austin and who was, you know, personally quite interested in children's issues. And he told me, you know, he said, you know, my editor's not going to let me write about child well-being. And I said, you know, my first reaction was like really offended and outraged and all this stuff. And I thought about it some more and it's like, well, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and read about child well-being. I want healthcare in kids. I want to know about kids that are facing hunger. I want to know about education outcomes. And so I think what he was getting at is, you know, what are the key findings? You know, what is the news out of the data book? And I think that's something that we always, many of us in the network, you know, try to remind everyone is just, you know, the data book itself is not the news. The news is really the findings, you know, what are those key findings? And that is a way to make it appeal, you know. So when we're talking to folks, even in far corners of the state, the ability to say, you know, this new thing is out and here are the top findings from it and here's why this matters, you know, including in your area. So really drawing that out for people has been really important.
Do you, that makes me think, do you send different information, different versions of the press release to different regions?
So we used to, and I think, you know, that can be a whole lot of work. And I think, you know, the main thing we want is we're pitching and we want these media outlets to basically bite and say that they're interested. And I think especially the way that Casey supports, you know, with the embargoed versions and everything, the ability to say to somebody, you know, way in the western corner of Texas, let's say in El Paso, you know, this new thing is coming out. You know, there's going to be, you know, really important findings in it that are relevant in your area. Because of the data center, we can also pull, you know, localized information and make sure you have stuff that's relevant. We can connect you or help you find some maybe service provider, you know, in your area to interview along with the data book, you know, part of your story. But we don't necessarily need a separate press release for them. We just need to make sure that we can get a conversation going with them. And maybe on the phone, you know, our Kids Count researcher or somebody at Casey nationally can talk them through some of the implications. But otherwise, it turned into us sort of guessing like what every different media market is going to want. And I think it was just more efficient to try to get folks in conversation with us.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one of the things we want to know is what folks have learned that, you know, we can avoid doing that you may want to do differently. So is there anything you've learned over the time that you've been releasing it that you could tell us you'd rather not do again or that you'll change and do differently this year?
Sure, it's a great question. Every year it's a little different. Again, I think leading with those key findings, right? So we don't start our press releases or our email blasts or anything else with new report, you know, new report finds, just because that happens all the time. There's new reports and that's not news. But, you know, 1 in 4 Texas kids living in poverty, you know, according to new report, is definitely, we found to be much more effective at kind of getting people's attention. So, you know, it's on us, I think, as the state groups to sort of crunch and dig into, like, what are the 3 or 5 key findings from the data book with implications for Texas. It's been really important for us, too, to make some connection between this national report and what's happening in Texas. So this month, obviously the data book has a big focus on the census and census undercount, which is a big deal in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, all of the narrative about children in Texas has to do with immigrant children coming to this country and what's happening to them in our state. And so even though the data book does not focus on that, I can't realistically expect to get a whole lot of coverage on this thing that's like, here is the definitive report on how kids in Texas are doing, and ignore the biggest story of the day. And so I need to find a way in my pitch to just sort of say, like, well, what's happening here? Our legislative session starts up again in January. So even now in June, I could say, what does this show us that reinforces, things that lawmakers will need to look at when they come back in January? How can this inform that agenda? So I think those are some of the pieces. I think one other tricky one is really knowing your sources and your relationships with your media outlets in the state, particularly as it relates to the embargo. I think one of our really big learnings last year was, a lot of media outlets, if you give them something under embargo, they will assume that that means they are not allowed to really report that story before the embargo lifts, meaning they can't basically interview lawmakers about the findings of the report. They can't interview anybody else because they're not allowed to show it to anybody and they're not allowed to do anything with it. And when we've gotten that feedback, it means that the embargo is not working for some of them the way that it should. And so in some cases, we've been able to, green light their ability to do some work on the story so that they can have a story, almost ready when the data book embargo lifts. But I think it's just really being clear about, if this is under embargo, what does this mean? And then getting those journalists, the resources that they need to be effective.
Yeah, that brings me to the question about, what kind of outreach are you doing directly to reporters? It sounds like you're reaching out to a good number of them personally to make sure they understand what you're sending them. And so how do you do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of it is email, personalized emails to folks. And again, the data book is such a great resource because, you don't have to be, again, like a child well-being reporter, right? You can be the healthcare reporter or a state government reporter or anything, so really tailoring it a little bit to, those folks. And I've had a lot of success, again, if I can get from my, colleagues, some agreement on what are the 3 to 5 key takeaways that are so important for Texas from these data. Those are really a lot of the things that I use to pitch with. We have this new report that the Annie Casey Foundation is putting out. Among the findings, we have some things that are really going to resonate. Can we set up a time, to talk, do kind of a pre-interview, with our Kids Count analyst, researcher, get them the things that they need. I've also found for TV, but also for web, almost anybody, some of those great things that Casey produces, like those one-pagers for each state with all the colors, that just have the indicators, the data sheets, actually offering those, when you're, doing an interview or following up on maybe a TV interview, because they can use those graphics on screen. They're really crisp and clean and effective, but they need to know that they're there, or you need to give them permission, like, hey, if you want to use this, here's the file, here's the graphic, that you can use, and that makes it more likely that they're going to use them.
Are you mostly reaching out to them via email, or do you call them? Or
it's mostly email, with folks that we have relationships with. Again, I think anything where I'm previewing content that's going to be in the data book, it's somebody that I already have a relationship with. And again, that initial ask, email is not overwhelming with information, because my main ask is, do you want to learn more? Can I, get you some information on this? So that's pretty short and sweet and kind of compelling. And then if they say, yes, send me what you've got, then I could send them maybe like, the key findings, a little more information. If we're in the embargo period, I can send them the link where they can get the embargoed copy. And then I can offer to set up maybe a call with them and our Kids Count researcher, and that sort of keeps it moving. And, if you put out 20 or 30 of those kind of individual email queries, maybe you get, I don't know, 6 to 10 possibly that will bite and maybe be interested.
Yeah, that makes a big difference, right? Instead of just having a press release in your inbox, having a Dear Oliver, here's something you might find interesting in this note on top of it, right? And it's a lot of data. It's a lot of stuff to expect people to get through, if it just lands in their lap. So I think as much heads up as possible, is really helpful. I have a couple more questions for Oliver, but Tara or Anna, jump in if you have any questions or just additional information you might want to share. We're recording it, so other folks might watch it later.
But there's also Teresa and Maggie and a few others.
Oh, folks on the phone. For some reason, they're not showing up on my screen, but okay, that's good to know.
What happens is, like, I can see their names, but then they're on the phone because they called in.
Okay, perfect. Oh, yes. So any questions from folks on the phone, too, feel free to jump in, even though for some reason I don't see you. While people are thinking about what their questions might be, one thing I was wondering, Oliver, is whether you get much attention from outside the major markets. I mean, obviously Texas has some of the biggest media markets in the country, and most of our states don't, most of our Kids Count states don't. So certainly mine doesn't. So what do you do a different kind of outreach to more rural areas or places where folks have smaller media markets?
It's a really good question. I think we have a lot of folks concentrated in those major areas, and it's not really just about where they live. It's just like, where do folks get their information? So some of these statewide kind of things in Austin, do penetrate elsewhere, including in rural areas, because if it's radio, there are things that are picked up. There are a couple of networks in our state of like community newspapers, things like that, where again, the content gets picked up elsewhere. And so those can have a lot of bang for the buck and can be really effective. But, I think radio stations, TV stations in those smaller towns and those rural areas can be great. And I think it's just, cultivating those relationships, maybe Kids Count is a good kind of first opportunity to reach out and pitch those folks, but maybe it's just, if that the data book's coming out in June, maybe at the beginning of the year, you're kind of sending notes to those folks and introducing yourself and finding out like what they like to cover, how they like to get information, and then telling them that you'll have something for them, in the summer. But that, that's been really effective. I think we've seen a good amount of rural stuff. Sometimes they need that rural angle or that local angle, which can be the data, but also needs to be a food bank or needs to be, a school-related kind of advocacy group or something else. So, we have a rural hospital kind of association. And so anything that you're covering, you make it a little more compelling by saying, you could make a nice story out of this by also talking to our friends at the such and such, and particularly if it's TV, right, they're going to need somebody, in their area that they can get on camera most likely.
Right,
So,
yeah, good point.
So just think about where folks get their information and then try to go there.
I'm going to pause for a minute just in case it's hard for someone to jump in on the phone. I'm usually on the phone in meetings like this. So I'll pause. Any questions?
This is Terry Haven in Utah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, yeah. Okay. So I've been doing Scout for almost 26 years. And one of the things I've never done, which I did last year and will never do again, is release our state data book on the same day as the national book. And I'm not sure if anybody else has done that, but I'd be interested to hear if anybody had a successful release doing that, or if, I mean, we're not going to do it again, but it was just interesting. I thought, oh, it'd be great, but it was not good.
Anybody have experience?
I mean, I would say in Texas, this is Oliver, you know, we try to keep them as far away as we can. And again, thinking about, you know, the audiences, both the journalists as well as the Texans that are interested in, you know, these topics, they're not really going to distinguish between this report and that report. They just want to know, like, what are the findings? And, you know, the findings from our state data products and the national ones are very similar. And so when we space them out, we're really getting just sort of 2 bites at the apple to kind of share that information. I think the national ranking kind of stuff that's in the national data book is newsworthy and interesting. But yeah, I think we lose people when we try to get them to distinguish between one thing or another. So we've tried to space them out.
And this is Tara in Colorado. We have very similar experience, and we released our state data book in March. And we try to do it as early in the year as possible, and people still are really confused. I just got Bo Gammer at AECF just forwarded a media request from a local reporter who was asking him for updated information in our data book. So it's just like reporters who cover this frequently still can't differentiate them, and it makes it really challenging to say the same thing twice in a year sometimes, because they're like, didn't we just write about this? And I often get that for the national data book. So I've moved over to really talking about Colorado's position within the national rankings, because that's a more traditional kind of news hook, or like this year talking about the census or the theme of the national report has been a lot easier to get interest, and then really focusing on the Colorado trends in our data book.
I would also say, you know, Casey is fairly particular, right, about the way we refer to the national data book and a lot of other pieces. And I think with our own state products, I feel like we have more flexibility in sort of like what we call it. So we certainly, you know, we don't use the data book kind of terminology for our state stuff. You know, we, you know, give it sort of its own branding that still has kids count, but has, you know, what is the theme we're conveying this year? You know, what are we doing with it? And part of that has been to just sort of distinguish for public audiences a little bit better, you know, that it's a different thing.
Any other questions? Or sage advice?
I'll ask a question. So I'm curious what you guys do around outreach to policymakers. Like, do you do a press release that goes out to your state policymakers? Do you mail them the book? Do you do an event? Just kind of curious what others do in that area.
Y'all go ahead.
This is Tara. For the national data book, we don't do a lot because they're not in session here in our state legislature. For our state data book, we put one of those dolls, handmade dolls, on every chair of the legislators when they get their book. So it's really obvious. You come into your session in the morning and there's the data book, among many other things, but that's kind of our signature attention-getting tactic.
We definitely distribute both the national and the state pieces, you know, to lawmakers, to their staff. You know, we're able to do that here in Austin and the Capitol, you know, spread out over a little bit of time. Sometimes we'll put a separate kind of cover letter in it, or, you know, use the opportunity of kind of going office to office to do some other things at the same time, you know, talk about the issue areas we work on. But again, you're helping, right? You're bringing like some key resources. But again, standing alone, the data book, like in Texas, particularly in a place where the numbers are pretty dismal, you know, a lawmaker or a staffer may not know exactly what to do with that. So I think really connecting that or accompanying that with, you know, policy solutions, or a couple of concrete ideas, or something that brings it to life a little bit, has been helpful for us. And then I think distribution also to local leaders, area foundations. I mean, we've really tried to build up over the years. The lawmakers, it's good for them to have it. It's also good for influential people back in their districts to have it. So we've tried to do a little bit of both of those things.
Thanks.
Anna, what do y'all do?
Well, last year, so this is only my second time doing this, and so we're based in Chicago, but obviously our state capital is in Springfield. So last year we mailed a copy of the national book to every district office, which gets kind of pricey. And then you maybe only get a little bit of a response back. So I was kind of curious if there were any more cost effective or a better return on investment, I guess I would say. Since I know most people are in the same boat where their legislators aren't in session when the national book is released, in order to do some sort of event at the Capitol or something like that.
And do you have a state data book in Illinois?
Yeah, so for the state data book, then we do the same thing where we spread out the time and had the same issue. People are still confused about it. And in that one, we were able to do more around the release and building some relationships there. But I was curious if people did anything with their policymakers for the national books, or if you just kind of focus all the efforts on the state data book.
I want to make sure if there's any more questions on the phone. We just have a minute or two left, so jump in. If not, I have one. I'm really curious about one thing, Oliver and Tara and others, if you've run into this, but I saw one of our main state reporters the other day, an AP correspondent, tweet that if he hasn't agreed in advance to an embargo, that there's no such thing as an embargo. Have y'all ever run into that? And is that going to become more common if a couple of AP guys are talking about it on Twitter, then maybe it's becoming more prevalent?
I have not had anyone break an embargo on purpose, sometimes accidentally. I wonder if it's kind of an embargo against government paper information or people with more power than us. I think for a children's advocacy organization, most people are like, oh, that's fine. It's not like let's lock horns over this usually, but
right.
Yeah.
It's not like the Mueller.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I don't send stuff out in those initial queries, right? I'm really just asking who's interested with the understanding of here's when it comes out. And if I'm interacting with somebody that way, as somebody I know or somebody that I've been connected with, then I don't really see any problems with it. I think I would agree as a reporter that if somebody blasted out, and attached this thing, and I'd never met them in my life, and they just said, hey, don't do anything with this for a week, I don't think you really do have an obligation, and you never heard of this person, and you don't know who else has it or what the rules are. But I do think, the embargo is great for giving people enough time to read this thing, but I think many of us have probably had the experience that, you get a lot of coverage that first day, but you also get coverage that kind of goes on for a while. So I think not getting too hung up on it and just really thinking about, reporters are busy like us, so how do we let them know this is coming so they're not surprised, give them enough time to read it and report it and very clearly spell out what are the main takeaways from it, and kind of help them, with that coverage without making it too complicated.
Yeah, for the embargo period for our state data book, I also do a similar approach and just send out kind of an advisory and with the individual notes to reporters I know especially. And I try to meet the meet them where they are during that embargo period, and also the types of media. So at the beginning of the period, I'll host a reporter preview webinar, just mostly for print and radio reporters are the ones who show up for that. And that just helps, and it's well in advance so they can still read it. It's not like the day before. So they get the overview, the big picture of it. And that has really been good for our kind of niche reporters. That we have an education website and a health website. So they dive in pretty significantly. And then radio tends to pick up audio from that as well. And then for the day of the release, I'll have a media availability. So I'll have all the experts and CEO and everyone prepared, and also Spanish speaking spokespeople in one location at a certain 2 hours and during the day that TV tends to want those interviews. And so that's been really helpful in cutting down on the stress of getting those during the release day. You get these bizarre emails or calls like, 4 p.m. Can we talk to you right now? And so that's helped just like move that all together, and you have your people all ready to go.
That's really good. Both of y'all really good and helpful. Unfortunately, we're already out of time. Yay, these go fast. But I just wanted to, Tara, and I'm sure Tara and Oliver would agree that if you put a question maybe on KidsNet under this AMA announcement, that we could like have a answer some questions that way or via email or whatever. And Bo, who Tara mentioned from the Casey Foundation, had sent an email that he couldn't be on today, but he wanted everyone just to know that they could send questions to him. And his email is easy. It's media@aecf.org. So media@aecf.org. So thanks especially to Oliver for your time today, and for all of you for being on. And we'll see you next month, we think. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you, Laura. Thanks for hosting.
Yeah.
Bye.